So I've been doing my research and I found this wicked rooftop. It's in central London, and I'm going to set my time-lapse up there now and do a little demonstration for you. So tonight I'm going to be doing two types of time-lapse, and the first one I want to talk to you about is the static time-lapse. Now, the reason why I love this time-lapse is it's so easy to do. All you need is a stills camera, a sturdy tripod, and something called an intervalometer. So when I'm setting a time-lapse shot, the first thing I'll do is take the camera off the tripod, and I kind of move the camera around, kind of set up different compositions until I find something that I'm happy with. And one of the things I love about time-lapse, but also it's kind of a bit of a curse at the same time, is you've got to be a perfectionist, because if you sort of don't really commit to a shot and you just kind of quickly set it up, maybe it's not level or not in focus, and you leave it there for an hour, you kind of come back and you check that footage and you've literally just wasted an hour of your time and you can't use any of that footage. So it really is a baptism of fire, because if you get it wrong, you kind of pay a heavy price of just wasting your time. So you really, really want to get it right before you kind of commit to doing an hour-long time-lapse or something like that. Now, I recommend shooting in manual mode. Sometimes if you're shooting a sunset or a sunrise, you might want it in aperture mode. This is because the exposure is sort of changing with the scenery. However, if you're not that kind of skilled in post-production, you end up with just really flickery footage because each shot has a different exposure and isn't consistent. So to kind of keep everything consistent, you want to be shooting in manual mode, and this is going to limit the flicker as much as possible in camera. And then once you've set your camera to manual mode, the next thing you want to do is kind of get your ISO down to as low as you possibly can. The reason why you want to have a low ISO is because it lowers the noise in the image. So if you shot like a really high ISO, you might not need a very long shutter speed, but then your footage is going to be super grainy and it's just not going to look very nice. So using a lower ISO and a longer shutter speed, that's going to give you a much, much higher quality image. And also you get the added bonus of kind of light streaks and loads of cool effects that you would get in a long exposure. And lastly, your aperture. Now, when you're doing landscapes, you kind of want everything to be in focus. So it's not like this shot where it's kind of got quite a wide open aperture. You want everything to be kind of closed down and in focus. Using an aperture of f8 or f11 is going to ensure that your photos are crisp, sharp, and of the highest of quality. So that's very, very important that your kind of everything's in focus. Otherwise, it's just going to look a bit rubbish and a bit amateur. So I'm just going to frame up. I've got a nice skyline behind me here. I think that's quite a nice shot. I've got my slider in the foreground. I've got the buildings in the background. And what I'm going to do next is just take a little test photo and maybe lower the ISO as well. I'm on quite high ISO at the moment. So I'm going to go down to about 1600. Let's just see how that comes out. Yeah, that's great. And I'm just going to tilt the camera up a bit as well, just to get a bit more of the sky. I've also got the moon in the background, so that's going to look really great. Cool, so I'm happy with that. So the next thing we're going to do is switch the lights on so you guys can see what I'm doing. Finally, once you've got your shot locked off, your settings locked into the camera, the last thing you want to do is set up your intervalometer. And the intervalometer that I'm using for my static setup is a Canon TC80N3. It's a really, very good, reliable kind of remote. However, you can get them off Amazon for about 10 or 15 quid, and I've used them loads of times and they do the job just fine. So just go through my settings once more. We're going to skip through this part because we don't need that for what we're doing tonight. The next is interval. We've got a 4-second interval. That's going to give us plenty of time for the camera to write to the card, and we're not going to get a backlog of photos. Long exposure, I've set it to 2 seconds. I'm on a 1-second exposure, but I mean, it's always better to be on the safe side. And frames is set to infinity. So that's going to keep going until I tell it to stop. So it will take 25 minutes for that to take all the photos I need, but I'm just going to let it run because I've got quite a big card in there and it doesn't matter too much if it's going to be taking them. So once you're happy, all you have to do is press start, but the first thing we're going to do to save battery is just to turn the screen off. So I've turned my screen off and ready to go, and I'm just going to press start on that. So after 25 minutes, I have my 250 photos, and yeah, I'll be quite happy with that. So I'm going to leave that one to keep going whilst I set up my next shot. I've got my static time-lapse running nicely, and now we're going to move on to my motion control time-lapse rig. Now, I've kind of gone ahead and already set this up. I've sort of scouted out a location that I quite like the look of. I want to get a nice shot of these buildings, and it's on a rail here, and what's going to happen is it's going to move across the rail and get a nice shot kind of overhanging the rooftop here. So the camera's going to like kind of look over, pan down, and kind of move across. So I've kind of got that already framed up. I've done some kind of test exposures in camera as well. So I've kind of got all that set up already, as I kind of talked about earlier. A bit more about the rig I'm using today. It's a dynamic perception stage 0, and that is the rail. It's 6 foot long, comes with a motor and a cart. And then to control the rig, I'm using an Emotimo TB3 Black Edition. Now this is really cool because it's very intuitive. You control everything with a nunchuck, sort of a bit like a Wii controller, and it also has a pan and tilt motor in it as well. So you're getting all 3 axes of movement with this rig, and that is basically creme de la creme of time-lapse. So we're going to get some really, really exciting stuff tonight. So the first thing you want to do is turn your machine on, and once that happens, you kind of connect your little nunchuck, and you want to choose the 2-point move. So you go select, you move it to your starting position. I've already got it in my position, so I hit next. And then the next one is you want to move it to your end position. Now I'm not going to move it all the way to the rail for this example, so I'm just going to move it slowly. So to move the rig, you just sort of tilt it like this. And as you can see, it's moving along quite nicely. One of the annoying things about this rig is the motors have to be super, super torquey. But what that means is they're quite slow. So it could take quite a while for it to get to the other end of the 6 foot rail. So I'm just going to stop it here. Then you kind of use the analog stick to move the camera around. And this is super cool. And because I'm getting it kind of looking up, I want to kind of have the camera pointing down for when it finishes. So I'm going to do that. I'm happy with that. Next is the interval. Now the Emotimo does the intervals a bit differently to how an intervalometer does it. You don't get one for interval and one for exposure time. It's all kind of combined. So for this one, I want at least 3 seconds between my photos, and the exposure is 5 seconds. So I'm going to make my interval 8. And I really like this Emotimo because it's kind of super clever in the way that it kind of presents the data to you. Now it's telling me how many frames do I want, but not only that, it's telling me how long it's going to take to complete that movement. At the moment, it's set to 240 frames. I want 10 seconds of footage, so I'm going to boost that up to 250. So yeah, I've got it on 250 now. That's saying it's going to be about 33 minutes, which is pretty good to be fair. Sometimes if you're doing astro time-lapse photography, it can take anywhere up from 1 hour to 2 hours. So 30 minutes really isn't that bad. So once I'm happy with that, you click next. And then the next thing it comes up with is static time. So the static time basically means how long the camera is going to be waiting after it's kind of done the motorized move before taking the next photo. So I want it to be maybe half a second, because that's just going to give the camera enough time to settle before taking the next photo. Yep. And then once you're happy with that, you move on to the next section. And this is basically asking you how many frames you want to ramp in and out. And what this means is instead of going at a constant speed, it sort of like gradually speeds up and then slows down. And this is quite nice, it's quite subtle and kind of gives you like an in and out point of your footage. So I normally give it like 50 frames of ramping. So yeah, once you're ready, you just hit start or move to the starting position. So then you basically just wait around, let it do its thing, and then kind of just check in and see what your results are like. So I've just finished my motion control time-lapse rig move. I'm really happy with how the footage has turned out. It's time to go into post-production.